my strongest memory of those war years is the sound of the air raid warning telling you that the bombers are on their way. And if I hear it now, my stomach still turns over. We had a lot of air raids on, and I spent quite a bit of time with my grandparents who were still living in a house in Hammersmith. And I can remember 1940 we had 59 nights consecutively with bombing raids on the city. And from Hammersmith you could actually see the glow of all the fires. That's when St Paul's had a number of incendiary bombs on St Paul's Cathedral that night. The whole of the city was up in flames. But of course, when the raid is over, you get the all clear, which is a steady note, very reassuring. But you take it in your stride. One of the houses, only about 5 houses from my grandmother's house, that had a direct hit, and they were friends of mine that were killed in that. So war has a very double-edged feeling about it. You know, my memories are quite mixed.
The air raid started with the German bombers bombing the airfields, really, because what they wanted to do was wipe out the Royal Air Force, and then they could invade the country. But with the Battle of Britain, which we eventually won, but it was a near thing, then the invasion was definitely off, because once we've held master of the air, there was no question of being invaded.
Psychologically, it was quite a strain, because when those raids were on, if I was staying with my grandparents for a weekend or something, we would go into the air raid shelter.
There were frightening times, but for instance, we went into shelters which were often nearly knee-deep in water when they were outside, you see, because they had steps down. And like the weather we've had now, when you walked in, it was soaking wet. My husband's family had a shelter in the garden, and they had to sleep in there sometimes, whereas we didn't have anything like that.
Yes, my next door they built an air raid shelter in the garden, and with my mother we all piled into this air raid shelter. But she soon said, "Come on, we're not going to stay in here any longer. Let's get into the bath. Let's go have a bath and blow the bombs." Yes, I can remember all that.
Well, we had to start with air raid shelters called Anderson shelters, outside, sort of things like that, partly covered with earth. And then later on, they had big, something as big as a table, with metal top, very strong. We went underneath that on the ground.
Well, we had a very heavy table, and my father and mother used to sleep under the table, but I said, "Blow this, I'm sleeping upstairs in my bed," which I did.
We used to sleep downstairs, and the reason that we did was because we had a house which had a chimney, and we discovered from photographs that the best place to be in a house is downstairs next to the chimney breast. So that was where we used to sleep. But when the bombs started again, years later, because there was a space in between them and there wasn't much, my father and mother went downstairs, but I'm afraid I became impatient. I mean, I used to draw the clothes over my head as the flying bombs went over and think to myself, well, if they hit, they hit. So that was that. They never did hit, thank goodness.
We took it very seriously in the beginning. No gaps between the curtains, and blackout boards put up over the windows, and people would go out with a little torch along the pavement. And actually, if you were a kid in your teens, it was quite fun. But it was important.
I went home with Mother to my great joy. Well, then, of course, once I was back in Ashford, I found that there was strips of brown paper over all the bedroom windows, put up by Father. Well, the suggestion, you see, that against flying glass. I mean, if a bomb dropped on you or something, well, you all went to glory, that's one thing. But what people dreaded was air raids. Unless it demolished your house or part demolished the house. The main trouble was from flying glass because windows got broken.
When the air raids came on, well, they're very nerve-wracking. The air raids sirens went, and then you could hear the aeroplanes above.
In the early stages, what we used to get was a lot of air traffic. You could hear our planes coming out, and you tended to hear them coming home again, back to Heathrow or wherever they went over our thing. And you would listen, and sometimes you could hear the stragglers, those that had been hit and were trying to make it. And there was, and you get them this terrible low note. They sounded as though they were having the engine equivalent of a very bad cough. And you'd hear this low grunt, as though they were straining like Billy-O, and every now and again they'd miss a beat, and I'd think, God, is he going to come down? Sort of foolishly looking about me to see if something was going to. And then usually they started again, but you just prayed that they'd make it. I don't think I ever heard the sound of an enemy aircraft. There may have been an odd one mixed up with it for all I knew, but I wasn't aware of it. It was just our boys going out.
I think there wasn't the same attitude to the subsequent weapons they used, which were the doodlebugs.
There came a time when they sent over doodlebugs, they were called. These were self-propelled, and you heard them. You heard them coming. You could hear them in the dark. You could see them in the light. And then they'd switch themselves off and start wavering about, never quite knowing where they were going to end up.
You could always hear them coming because there was a pulse. And the danger point was when the pulse stopped, because you knew it was heading for the ground. So if the pulse was over there, you didn't worry. If it was over there, you didn't worry. You only worried if it was near you.
And if you ever heard a doodlebug, they went chuff, 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 then stopped. When it stopped, you knew that it was going to dive, and wherever it hit, and I think it had somewhere about 1/2 ton of explosive in it, and it made quite a mess.
That can be a bit tense. You're waiting for it. And of course, subsequent to those, we had the V2 rockets, which were quite fearsome because there was absolutely no warning at all. And the first one fell in Chiswick, and the government put it out on the news that it had been a gas main had exploded. But all the people there, we knew it had been something that had come. You know, we didn't know what it was at first.
And all of a sudden, manhole covers were jumping into the air with explosions, and nobody knew why. And it was rockets that had been developed by the Germans at a place called Peenemünde on the Baltic. As a result, the RAF bombed Peenemünde to try and put their research out of kilter.
And then gradually the word got out that the Germans were using rockets from the coast of France. And of course we all know now, when from the Middle East troubles, you know what rocket warfare can be like. Not much to laugh about in it now.
I know I was cycling through a footpath that had fences on either side, and I looked over the fence, and what did I see but an incendiary bomb, which is now in Egham Museum. I also had another incendiary bomb, which I think I got down Chertsey Lane, because there were a lot of incendiary bombs dropped in the area. And so I had that one. I even had a third one, which had an explosive end on it. And I thought, well, if I can get this explosive end off and render that safe, then I thought about it. I must be mad, because they've taken the bomb to pieces, it exploded, there wouldn't be much left of me. I took it to a field known as Daisy Meadow, which had a pond in it, and I threw it into the pond. And that is where it is now, but there's no pond in there because the whole area has been flattened and there's offices there.
Well, when we were bombed out, my mother rather went to pieces and wasn't much help. My father went off to find people to remove our furniture because we had to clear out. The actual being bombed was rather strange. It was a feeling of time standing still. We had a Morrison shelter in the dining room, and I was under that, and my mother was under there. My brother and my father were out fire watching and so on. Glass was tinkling down a little at a time, and there was dust up one's nostrils. I suddenly remembered I'd left my violin on top of the Morrison instead of in with me. And I can remember going like this, feeling if it was still there, and luckily it was still there. It all seemed to last a long time, but people came to see if we were all right. The woman next door but one was killed, but apart from that we were all right. And there was such a feeling of comradeship, and people came from the next street with trays of tea, and everybody was so helpful. There was a wonderful spirit.
From time to time you came across the results of it. For example, when our factory was hit on one occasion, we had to clear up on the machine I had been on, and I found a man's foot in a boot, and that was pretty nerve-wracking. Of course, you might be next, but that's the way it was.
Oh yes, we talked about the war quite a lot, particularly when the bombs landed in the park not far from where we lived. It shook the house, and the following day we went out to have a look at the surroundings, and we looked at the roof, and where the tiles had jumped 2 or 3 inches, you could see gaps along the rows of tiles where they jumped and settled back where they should. But no tiles were damaged, and the place was not damaged. But there was an effect in the sense that the roof looked disturbed.
I came home one lunchtime and I could hear a sound of a German aircraft. You knew a German aircraft because they were diesel engine and they went boom, boom, boom. My father and I rushed outside and looked out, and there we saw a German aircraft circling in our area, and the guns were firing at it, but nowhere near the aircraft, and it circled for a few minutes and then flew away.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling. Here are the Reichs in ambush.
Lord Haw-Haw, if you've heard of Lord Haw-Haw, he worked for the German propaganda people, and he said that if anybody displayed a German aircraft that had been shot down, they would bomb them. At that time, we had a Junkers 88 bomber in our fire station yard for the public to see. The point being, they were trying to raise money to buy a Spitfire, which at that time was supposed to cost £5,000. That was on the Monday, and on the Friday, a stick of bombs dropped from Egham Meads right over to the Grove, and they were 15 500-pound bombs. One bomb landed on the pavement outside a draper's shop called Arkel's, and the daughter and two of the evacuees were killed. There was a lot of things said, the plane was just jettisoning its bombs because fighters were chasing it, or the guns were getting too close. But I don't believe it, because having seen what I'd seen, I think they were doing what they said they would do, and that was if we were displaying a German bomber, they would bomb the area.
But I can remember the ghastly experiences, lying down on platforms, lying down in the trains, not hearing these things coming over and knowing that you've got to get down before it bombed you down, before it came down.
Every now and again the sirens used to go, and you used to work out where to hide in the office in case it got bombed. But after a while we became a bit complacent about that, and people said, that again, and let's carry on doing your job.
My friend, I had a phone call at the office to say she'd been bombed, and they let me go over. It was in Putney, and when I got to East Sheen, and when I got to her house, it was absolutely awful. The whole road was just all, rubble. So the mother and the son and Vera, they came out of the house, and it was quite traumatic to see them. They were very dishevelled, and I took them home to mother in Englefield Green. And they had baths and about 2 inches of water, 2 or 3 inches of water, and we cleaned them. And they stayed with us for a long time until they were allocated a property in Hammersmith. They did that in those days. They gave you some property to live if you'd been bombed out.
The most frightening thing for me was that coming back from a meeting of the Air Cadet Corps, which I belonged to, at night in the dark, the bombs started and I could hear the aircraft guns going, and the broken shrapnel was landing on the grass not far from where I was walking. So that was a little bit disturbing.
I did a messenger duty twice a week there, And that meant, really, me going to the ambulance station. I wasn't allowed to undress. I had a bed which I could lay on, and if I could sleep. And my duties were not, they weren't ever required, but should Egham be bombed, communications aren't like what we've got now. They were very basic. I mean, telephone lines, not everybody had a telephone. And so the whole idea was if there was a message, say from the ambulance station, I had a bicycle and I'd get on my bike and I'd take it to where it was required and deliver it by hand, by mouth.
And the King and Queen visited the East End quite a lot. And in the end, the Germans bombed Buckingham Palace. And the Queen Mother, as she became, she said, well, thank goodness we had to put up with what the people put up with. They haven't exempted us, is what her reaction was. In actual fact, there was talk of the royal family going to Canada. And the Queen said, well, the children can go, but they won't go without the King. The King won't go without me, and I'm staying here. So that was that. They stayed in London.
It is said that you'd be safer if you were in the forces than being stuck on the Thames, because we did have a lot of activity overhead. I think the question used to be, was there going to be an end to this? It was a very long time, 4 years.